Wyoming Territory, December 1879, the snow had not stopped for 2 days. Thick white flurries blurred the world into silence and cold, and the wind howled like a wounded thing. On the edge of a narrow trail that cut through the foothills near the Bighorns, a young woman lay half buried in the drift, her lips blue and her arms wrapped tight around a bundle of cloth that barely stirred. Lena Parkhurst had not moved in hours. Her dress was torn at the hem, her boots soaked through, and her hair frozen to her cheek. But her arms held firm around her baby boy, even as her strength burned out like a dying fire. She had not meant to die like this, not here, not in the snow. The wagon that left her behind had belonged to her husband, or the man she thought was her husband. They had married fast back in Kansas after he promised her safety and land out west. He turned mean the moment they crossed the border into Cheyenne land. By the time they reached the mountains, he had taken her money, broken her nose, and left her and her 7-month-old son on the side of the trail with nothing but a half-full canteen and a threadbare shawl. She had walked until her legs refused to work. Now the world was white and quiet. She could not feel her toes. She could barely feel her son moving. She whispered his name through cracked lips. "Hale, stay with me." The wind answered, and then hoofbeats, slow, steady, getting closer. She could not lift her head, but she heard it. A horse. A saddle creaking. The crunch of boots in snow, then a man's voice, low and sure. "God Almighty." A shadow fell over her. Warm, gloved hands touched her shoulder, then gently pulled the blanket back from the baby's face. "He's breathing," the man said, quick now, urgent. "You hold on, madam." "You hear me?" She tried to open her eyes. Could not. The man worked fast. He pulled off his coat and wrapped it around them both, then lifted her into his arms with care. She was light as nothing, and the baby barely heavier. He mounted his horse with both of them cradled close. The animal snorted against the snow and turned back down the trail. "You'll never be alone again," he said into her hair. "I swear it." His name was Jude Payton, 32, cowboy, loner. He had been driving cattle east when the storm hit and took the long way around the pass to avoid the worst of it. That detour saved her life. He rode hard, pushing through the wind with one arm around her and the other steady on the reins. He talked to her in short bursts to keep her awake. "What's your name, madam?" No answer. "Baby's still breathing. That's good. You just hold on. We're almost there." An hour later, he reached his cabin tucked in a low grove, smoke still rising from the chimney. He kicked the door open and carried them both inside. The heat hit her like a wave. Jude laid her near the hearth, unwrapped the baby with careful fingers, then set to warming water and finding dry blankets. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Hale crying. She sat up too fast. "Hale, he's right here," Jude said, turning. He held the baby in one arm, gently rocking. "He's hungry." She blinked at him, her teeth chattering. "Who are you?" "Jude Payton. Found you off the North Trail." Lena reached for her son. Jude handed him over without hesitation. She held Hale close, tears sliding down her cheeks without permission. She had not cried once since her husband threw her from the wagon. It hit her all at once what could have happened. What almost did. Jude crouched beside her. "You need food, rest. The storm's not letting up anytime soon." She looked at him then, really looked, tall, rough around the edges. Brown hair long enough to curl under his hat. His coat was soaked through from carrying her. There was a deep kindness in his eyes, the kind that did not ask for anything back. She nodded once. He stood and brought her a bowl of stew. She ate with shaking hands, one arm still curled around Hale. Jude never looked away from them. That night, she slept on the cot near the fire while he took the floor. She woke twice to find him tending the fire, keeping it alive so the cabin stayed warm. In the morning, the storm had eased. Sunlight broke through the frost on the window pane. Lena sat up slowly, her muscles aching. She found Jude in the corner, boiling water for coffee, looking like he had not slept. "You saved us," she said softly. He looked over. "You would have done the same." "No," her voice cracked. "He left us to die, my husband." Jude's jaw tightened. He said nothing. "I do not know why I trusted him," she whispered. "I just wanted to believe someone could look after us. I was wrong." Jude poured her a cup and handed it to her gently. "You are not wrong for wanting good things." She stared at him, her hands wrapped around the warm tin mug. "You really meant what you said?" she asked. Out there in the snow, he met her eyes. "Every word." Lena looked down at her baby, then back at Jude, tears welled again. I do not even know what safe feels like anymore. Jude knelt beside her and placed his hand over hers. Then stay, he said. Let me show you. They stayed in that cabin for 5 days while the snow melted from the hills. Lena grew stronger each day. She laughed once quiet, surprised, and Jude had looked up like he had heard music. He never pried, never pushed. He chopped wood, cooked, cleaned, and held Hale when Lena needed sleep. The baby took to him fast, small fingers clutching Jude's shirt like he had known him forever. On the 6th day, Lena stepped out onto the porch with Hale in her arms just as Jude came back from splitting wood. She smiled at him, a soft, sure thing. You meant it when you said I would never be alone, he nodded, breath misting in the cold. I do. She looked down at Hale, then back at him. Then I want to stay. Jude dropped the axe, walked up to her. Reached out and touched her cheek, fingers brushing over the place where the bruise had been. Lena leaned into him. He kissed her, slow and careful, like he was afraid to break her. But she did not break. She wrapped her arm around his neck and kissed him back. The snow kept falling, but inside that cabin, a fire had started. One that would never go out. And for the first time in months, Lena Parkhurst felt warm. By the 3rd week of January, the deep freeze had loosened its grip around the cabin. Meltwater trickled down from the trees, and the days stretched longer, pale gold and still cold, but no longer cruel. Jude stood outside splitting kindling with slow, even strokes. His shirt clung damp to his back beneath his suspenders, steam rising from his shoulders in the morning chill. Lena watched from the corner of the porch, her shawl tucked close, and Hale asleep in the cradle Jude had built from leftover pine boards and a saddle blanket. You ever get tired of quiet? She asked, voice low so as not to wake the baby. Jude didn't pause in his work. No. Not when it means peace. She folded her arms, rubbing her hands along them. I never knew what silence sounded like until now. Back home it was always something drunk shouting, dogs barking, neighbors fighting through the walls. He wedged his axe into the stump and turned to face her. You weren't meant for that. I thought I was. She tugged at a loose thread near her wrist. Didn't think I deserved better, not after. Things. He didn't ask what things. She liked that about him. I ain't perfect, either, he said. I've done things I'd take back if I could. She looked up. Like what? He walked over and leaned against the porch rail, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. I rode with a crew out of Laramie once. Took cattle that weren't ours. I was 20 and dumb. Thought grit was the same thing as pride. She studied him. You got out. Left after our cook got shot over a tin plate of beans. Realized I'd rather be poor and clean than rich and dead. Lena smiled faintly. You cook better than any trail cook I've met. That's not saying much. She laughed under her breath, then reached down to adjust the edge of Hale's blanket. He's putting on weight. I can feel it when I carry him. You're feeding him good. He'll grow strong with you raising him. Her gaze lingered on the baby a moment before she spoke again. I don't know what I'm supposed to be now. I was a wife, but that was just a word someone else twisted. I thought being a mother might be all I had left. Jude's voice softened. You're more than both. She looked at him, unsure whether to believe it. Come spring, he added, I'll dig a plot for a garden out back. Could plant beans, squash, maybe some corn if we're lucky, she blinked. You're planning that far ahead, he didn't flinch. I am. Lena stepped down from the porch and walked toward him slowly, her boots crunching thin frost. You're not afraid I'll leave when I get strong enough? I'd help you pack if that's what you wanted. She stopped in front of him. I don't want to leave. The wind stirred her skirts. Jude reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't move away. I've been studying your hands when you work, she said. You don't waste motion. Everything you do's for something. I don't have time for things that ain't. You've made room for me and Hale, his brow furrowed just slightly. That was never a question. She reached up and touched his jaw, thumb brushing over a faint scar near his cheekbone. You ain't like any man I've known. I hope not. They stood like that for a long moment, the silence full and easy. Then Hale stirred in the cradle and let out a soft cry. Lena smiled and stepped back. He's got your lungs, Jude chuckled. I'll take that as a compliment. She bent to lift her son, rocking him gently against her shoulder. You ever think about having a family? She asked, voice quiet. Jude didn't answer right away. He watched her with the baby, the way her body curved protectively, how her lips pressed against Hale's forehead without thought. "I thought about it once," he said. "Didn't think it was something I'd get to have." She looked up at him. "And now," he stepped closer, not touching her, just near enough that she could feel his presence. "Now I'm thinking things I never let myself before." Her eyes didn't leave his. "Me too." He nodded once, and she could see how hard he was holding himself still, like any wrong move might break the spell between them. So she leaned forward first, resting her head lightly against his chest, Hale tucked between them. Jude's arms came around them both slowly, as if afraid the moment might vanish. It didn't, it deepened. And for the first time since she'd been left in the snow, Lena felt like she belonged somewhere. Not just safe, not just sheltered, seen. She didn't say anything else. Neither did he. They didn't need to. The thaw had begun. Not just in the land, but in the quiet space between two people learning what it meant to build something that could last. By early February, the snow had thinned into patches, revealing earth the color of rust and ash beneath the trees. The creek behind the cabin ran again, shallow but insistent, and the wind no longer bit so sharp. Jude had taken to leading their mare along the trail every morning to keep her legs strong after the long freeze. Lena watched him from the slope above the barn, Hale strapped snug against her chest in a sling made from an old flour sack. She carried a basket in one hand, careful not to let it tip, as she picked her way down to the water's edge. There, she knelt and dipped her cloth in the stream, scrubbing Hale's soiled linens clean with steady, practiced movements. Her knuckles were raw, but she didn't mind the sting. It was the first time she'd washed clothes without fear of them freezing solid before they dried. Jude's voice drifted over the rise. "You shouldn't be out here with your hands like that." She didn't look up. "They'll heal faster in the sun." He came down beside her, crouching to rinse his own palms in the cold water. "What's left of my coffee's still hot." "You ought to take a break." She wrung out a cloth and laid it on the bare grass beside her. "I can't remember the last time I sat down without something needing doing." "You're allowed to rest, Lena." She glanced at him, then at the baby curled warm against her chest. "He sleeps better when I'm moving." Jude looked at them both, quiet a moment. "You ever think about what kind of place you'd want to raise him in?" She shook her head. "I never thought I'd get past winter." "What if spring's just the start?" She met his gaze. "You'd want to keep us here that long." "I'd want to keep you longer than that." She didn't answer, but her fingers stilled on the cloth. A bird called overhead, sharp and bright, and the creek moved around them like a ribbon of glass. Back at the cabin, she hung the wash on a line Jude had strung between two cedars. The baby slept deeper now, his mouth slack, one hand curled tight against her collarbone. Jude worked near the barn, hammering new slats onto the trough. She watched him a while, then turned to go inside. That night, after Hale was down and the wind had quieted, Jude poured 2 cups of boiled chicory and passed her one. The fire snapped low, throwing long shadows across the room. Lena sat cross-legged on the cot, her dress hemmed dark with creek water. "You ever live with someone before?" she asked. He nodded. "Had a bunkhouse full of men for years. Ain't the same, but it teaches you who snores loudest." She smiled into her cup. "I mean quiet living, sharing your space." "Not until now." She studied him a long moment. "You're good at it." He shifted in his chair. "You ever think about marrying again?" Her hands tightened on the tin cup. "I think about what it meant the first time, what it cost. I won't ever take what ain't offered." "I know that," she said, voice soft. "I've known that since the second day." He looked down, thumb running along the seam of his trousers. "I've got land enough for a second cabin. Could build it come summer if you'd rather space." She rose and crossed to him slowly, standing over where he sat, then lowering herself into the chair beside him. "I don't want space, Jude." He turned toward her, eyes steady. "What do you want?" She set her cup aside and reached for his hand. "Something honest, something that stays." He laced his fingers through hers, the backs of his knuckles rough from work. "Then I'll build that with you." In the quiet that followed, she leaned her head to his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her without hesitation. Outside, the snow melted one drip at a time. Inside, the warmth was already there. By late February, the thaw had spread to the hills. Mud pulled at boot heels, and the trees, still bare, had begun to shift in the wind again instead of standing stiff with ice. Each day stretched a little longer, and the light inside the cabin took on a golden cast by late afternoon, warming the rough walls and setting motes dancing in the air. Jude had begun repairing the fence behind the barn where elk had broken through during the worst of the snow. Lena watched him from the back stoop, Hale nestled in her arms, rounder now and more alert, with eyes that tracked the movement of birds above the trees. She adjusted the boy against her chest and called out, "You ever think of putting up a gate near the creek bend?" He glanced over one shoulder, hammer paused mid-swing. "I have. Was waiting to see if the water held steady." "It has." "Might make it easier to reach the lower pasture." Jude leaned against the post and nodded, eyebrows lifting slightly. "You think like land's yours," she shrugged. "I sleep under its roof. I feed its chickens. Seems to me I ought to care what happens on it." He dusted his hands and came toward her, the smell of cedar and soil clinging to him. "You'd want your name on it if it came to that." Lena looked down at Hale, who gripped her collar with both fists. "If a thing's worth keeping, it ought to claim you back." Jude reached for the porch rail but didn't sit. "I've been thinking on something. Reckon it's time I said it plain." Lena shifted her weight. "All right. I want to marry you, Lena, not just have you here, not just share the work. I want it real." She didn't answer right away. The wind moved her skirt around her ankles and Hale let out a soft sound, half sigh, half yawn. Jude's voice was steady. "I don't expect an answer now, but I want you to know where I stand." She stood and crossed the few steps between them. "You want to know what I fear most?" He met her eyes. "Tell me. That I'll wake one day and this will feel like it never belonged to me. It already does." She studied him, her face unreadable. "Then you'll need to teach me how to believe that." "I will," he said. "Every day." That night, after Hale was down and the wind had gone still, Lena took out the linen she'd brought west in a pocket of her old dress. It was frayed at the edges, but the embroidery along its corner was still neat. Her mother had stitched it when Lena turned 15, before sickness hollowed out the house she'd grown up in. She laid it on the table and smoothed it flat. Jude looked up from where he was brushing ash from the hearth. "That from home," she nodded. "I thought I lost it. Found it tucked behind the inside seam last week." He watched her a moment. "You miss them. They were good people. They just didn't last." Jude crossed to her, pulled out the chair opposite. "You ever talk about them?" She shook her head. "Not much left to say. Except that I wish they could have seen this." He reached across the table and touched her wrist, his thumb warm. "They'd be proud." She looked down at their hands, then back at him. "If I say yes, I'll want to plant lilacs. My mother loved them. I'll dig the bed myself. And I'll want to raise chickens that don't peck each other bloody. That's harder than it sounds. I'll build a better coop. And I'll want to take time to read." He smiled, slow and true. "Then I'll make sure there's light enough each night." She leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. "Then yes." Jude didn't speak, but his hand closed around hers like it was already a promise. They didn't kiss, not then. But when she rose and walked to his side and he stood to meet her, the quiet between them folded soft around their closeness. It was the kind of silence that held meaning, not lack. Outside, the moon rose above the bare trees, casting long, pale lines across the earth. Inside the cabin, Lena stood close enough to feel Jude's breath and rested her forehead against his chest. He whispered, "You'll never be alone again." And she believed him. Not because of the words, but because of every quiet thing he'd done to make them true. The wind had shifted again by mid-March, warmer now, with the sharp smell of thawed soil rising in the mornings. Jude leveled the last of the fence posts down by the east pasture, hammering the rails with care where the land sloped toward the creek. Lena was nearby, bent over a small patch of earth she'd cleared of stone, her skirt tucked up into her apron as she pressed her fingers into the furrows for peas. She straightened slowly, back aching just enough to remind her she'd earned the day's work. Hale sat in the wagon bed behind her, chewing on a strip of leather Jude had cut from an old harness. The baby's cheeks were pink from the sun and wind, his eyes tracking the horseflies that hovered and vanished again. Lena wiped a streak of dirt across her forehead with the back of her hand and glanced toward Jude. "You ever meet your folks' people?" she asked, brushing soil from her palms. Jude rested his forearms on the top rail. "Some of them were in Missouri. My mother had a sister lived east of the river." I saw her once when I was real young, didn't stay long. Why? He tugged a splinter from his thumb without flinching. My father didn't want nothing to do with her, said she married a man who wore cravats and read poetry, thought that made him soft. Lena huffed. Sounds like a man who didn't know much about real softness. He didn't. My mother died before he figured it out. Lena turned toward the wagon and lifted Hale into her arms. If Hale grows up and wants to write poems, I'll hang every one on the wall. Jude smiled with his mouth, not just his eyes. Then I'll build him a desk. They walked back toward the cabin together, Hale resting easy against her shoulder, his breath warm on her collarbone. The garden plot would need fencing, and the chickens had begun laying again. Inside, the cabin smelled of rosemary and flour Lena's afternoon biscuits cooling on the hearthstone. She set Hale in the cradle and took the biscuit tin from the mantel, offering one to Jude as he unlaced his boots by the door. We'll need to trade with the Taylors next week, she said, settling onto the bench beside him. They've got sugar and I'd like to bake something for the wedding. I'll ride out day after tomorrow, he said. Want me to ask if they'll lend a butter churn? She nodded. Long as we don't have to bring it back quick. Jude reached for her hand, his thumb running slowly over her knuckles. You nervous? She looked at him evenly. No, just want it to feel like us. It will. I don't need a preacher, she added. I just want to say what I mean and have it heard. I'll hear you. They sat a while without speaking, the fire catching low and steady behind them. Hale stirred once in his sleep, but didn't wake. That Sunday, they stood beneath the cottonwoods behind the barn, where the ground had dried enough to hold their steps. Lena wore her mother's shawl, the embroidery cleaned and mended. Jude had shaved that morning, his hair combed back with water and a bit of bare grease. He held a simple ring of twisted wire, something he'd shaped from the bit of silver his mother once wore as a brooch. They said their vows with no one else to hear but the trees, the creek behind them, and the horse who stood watching from the pasture fence. Jude spoke first, voice quiet but certain. I'll keep the roof strong and the fire lit. I'll be your shelter and your hand to hold. Lena answered with her eyes steady on his. I'll carry what's yours like it's mine. I'll keep the light in your quiet and raise our boy to stand straight. He slid the ring onto her finger. She kissed his palm, then his mouth. It was not hurried. It was not delicate, it was full. Afterward, they walked back toward the cabin, hands clasped, Hale tucked in Lena's arms. The sun broke through the clouds, casting long, clean light across the clearing. Inside, they boiled coffee and ate sweet bread Lena had baked with raisins she'd hoarded since January. Jude carved their initials into the doorframe with his pocket knife, just 2 marks, side by side, deeper than the rest. Days passed thick with spring. Hale grew into his legs and began to crawl, dragging himself across the cabin floor with determination. Lena stitched curtains from flour sacks and planted beans along the fence line. Jude built a second cradle for outside, so Hale could nap beneath the porch awning. One evening, as the wind softened and the days leaned longer, Jude came in from the barn with a splinter in his hand and a calm pride in his voice. Fence held through the storm, he said. Didn't lose a rail. Lena smiled from where she stood at the table, kneading bread. Told you it would. He came to her, pressing his forehead to hers, hands dusted with cedar and hay. You were right. She leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his breath. You always come home, always, and he did. Through planting and drought, through Hale's first fever and the long lean weeks before harvest, Jude was there. Quiet, steady as a post in the ground, they grew into each other not with urgency but with surety. Love for them had no sharp corners. It was built of hands made calloused by care, of eyes that met without flinching, and of a shared rhythm that matched the land around them. In the long years that followed, they never left that homestead. Jude added rooms as needed. Lena kept the garden. Hale grew tall, with his mother's calm and his father's quiet strength. And each night, with the fire low and the windows open to the sound of the creek, Lena would lie beside Jude and rest her hand over his heart. You still sure? She'd ask sometimes, her voice eased by sleep. Always, he'd say, and that was enough. It always was.